Well, thank you again. Boy, I want you all to come back in the morning because you are like model participants. This is great on the first couple rows. It's my privilege to introduce the first speaker. His name is Jule Maidenblick, the president of Calvin Theological Seminary. I had a role in helping him accept and find this position. I was on the search committee, well, the student version of the search committee when I was at Calvin Seminary in 2010. So glad he's hung around and he has proven his worth. And we of course we were enthusiastic about him when we interviewed him, and I'm still enthusiastic about him all these years later. The limited insight and observations I get to hear. So thank you, Jule, for introducing the seminary and then our next speakers.
Well, welcome everybody. We're glad that you're here. We know that there's a lot to do on a Saturday night in Phoenix, but you've chosen to come here. And I hope that at the end of this time, you'll actually walk away and go, I had a glimpse of seeing God at work, particularly as we will focus on the Calvin Prison Initiative. I'm going to talk about that in just a little bit. This is actually a joint event of Calvin University and Calvin Seminary. We have, in terms of people here in this room, and an opportunity. So, Brigitte, where are you at right now? Where's your? I thought you were in this room. Greg Elzinga, where are they at? You're my witnesses that I did introduce them. Oh, that's right. Greg Elzinga is talking to his wife. He did excuse himself from the table. Thank you, Warren, for remembering that hospitality. So, I know. They're checking the doors, seeing if they're open or not, I tell you. But, and it's a great honor, Andy. Thank you Pastor Andy, for hosting us. I've had the opportunity to be here in this church at different times. It reminds me of the fact that there's a whole world outside of Grand Rapids. And that is a good thing to note. If you want, I'll give you my cell phone. It starts with area code 815. Because I grew up in Fulton, Illinois, on the Mississippi River Farm and Community, and that was area code 815. And then after my journey, and I'll quick say that, give her a hand that she back. Thank you. That where I planted a church in New Lenox, Illinois, southwest side of Chicago, was also area code 815. So I was able to keep that in different ways. As Andy noted, privileged to serve as president. I'm in my 13th year. I still have people say, you're kind of new yet. You need to know I'm on my third Calvin University president. Galen Biker, we served together for a little time. Then Michael Leroy, and now obviously Weba Bohr. And part of that is just to note that there's obviously good connections in different ways. And this is one of those things that I know when people talk about, it's because of the work that we do together on that. If President Weba Bohr was here, one of the things that we're trying to be is consistent about sharing some stories, and one of them is that in 2026, we're going to have our 150th anniversary as Calvin Seminary and Calvin University. It started as a seminary, started as a training for school, for pastors. There was one professor with 5 students. In the fall, they had 7 students. They went up 40%. We've been trying to get a 40% increase every year from then. And you need to know that it's just been wonderful to delve into some of that history and to actually learn some of those stories and tell those stories again, because really it was an act of faith of a small denomination that actually was struggling since it was formed in 1857 to what leadership would look like. And they had a long pattern of actually calling the Netherlands for their next pastor and then getting them moved here. And that was from 1857 really to 1876. Then they began having young people say, we live here, we don't want to go to the Netherlands and then come back, we'd like to learn here. So they had mentoring programs. And eventually, there's a lot of stories about that, but eventually the Synod of the Christian Reformed Church said this is such a crucial issue, we actually have to move our Synod from June, because even then they met in June, because that was the time crops were, the harvest was, the seeds were planted and you waited for the harvest, but they met in February, and a person by the pastor of Georg Eggersbohr was the first then president, as noted, for Calvin University and Calvin Seminary. and he was inaugurated, on March 15th, 1876. Since that time, a lot of things happened. We've seen an increase of, for example, older students. Somebody was asking me at our table, and I told a little bit of the history. Yes, I'm a hog farmer's son from Illinois, but we moved to Florida. I could get in-state tuition, University of Florida Law School. Then came in 1991 to the seminary, and Jackie and I had a 4-year-old son at that point. And it turned out I'm not the only one at that era who comes in with a second career. And in fact, we've seen this. So the average age of the seminary now is about 35. And they actually, many times, starting with a class at a time. They're exploring their calling. And because we have distance education for over 10 years, they can do it from wherever they are, including Phoenix. And so they can start with a class at a time, and they decide, between God and their community, the external and the internal call, whether or not this is for them. And we're grateful for the numbers that we have. So we have over 300 students that right now 40 to 45% of them are international students. And when I mean international students, we usually put out a postcard that in the bottom right will identify the number of countries represented. And this is just the seminary. The university has a very similar story. But this past fall, we identified and we put them together. This is not all our students. It's just those who showed up for a particular day where we offered donuts afterwards. Argentina, Bolivia, Brazil, Canada, Chile, China, Costa Rica, Cuba, Dominican Republic, El Salvador, Ethiopia, Ghana, Guatemala, Indonesia, India, Japan, Kenya, Mexico, Nicaragua, Nigeria, Peru, South Korea, Spain, Taiwan, Uganda, Ukraine, United States, and Venezuela. 28 different nations. We do get wows. In the Christian Reformed Church, I've even got applause at times. But one of the things just to note about that, it reminds me of that, if you took the class from 1876 to now, in 1876, English was probably a second language. Well, some Dutch. So now, for example, the second largest group after the United States in the seminary, in terms of students, so about 52 out of our 300 some students, is 1 out of 6 comes from Korea. And that's why when Bob Knorr, our Director of Development, and we started this particular trip, we started with the largest Christian Reformed church in the United States. And it's not LaGrave. It's All Nations Church, just north of Pasadena, Lakeview Terrace. It's the one where the prayer summits of the Christian Reformed Church were held. And it was a wonderful opportunity to be at that church and talk about the topic of forgiveness. We did a book event with them. And then we also went to Palm Desert. We're now here, going to preach tomorrow for Harry. He gets a night off, that's why he's here, although he's working hard tomorrow in the liturgy at Maranatha Church, and then doing something in Tucson. So, and you'll actually, if you like the presentation tonight, you can come to Tucson on Monday, okay? And I just want to let you know, I hear this presentation, they get better and better every time. I'm going to tell you that. It's just like a good sermon. It can be told again and again. And they have stories and videos. You will enjoy it in so many different ways. I know that Grand Rapids can seem like a faraway way, but I want to tell you just a few little things. One, we have a Center for Excellence in Preaching that's been around for 18 years. It actually was a heartbeat from Neil Planiga, who when he went to someone like Rich and Helen DeVos said, and Rich said, "What's your greatest need?" He says, "I think preaching in the Christian Reformed Church." And Rich said, "I agree." So here's a start for the Center for Excellence in Preaching. One thing that I don't like about that title is it makes you think it's only for preachers. So if you lead a Bible study, you can actually type in the text and you look up resources. It has good books for reading and insights there, stories and illustrations. So the Center for Excellent Preaching is something I encourage all of you to check out because of the resources there. There is 1,000 congregations still in terms of U.S. and Canada, CRC churches. Last year, the Center for Excellence Preaching, led by Scott Ozay, we broke a certain record, and I'm going to just tell you the record. We had 1 million different times viewers of that website, 1 million. That's amazing how God has worked through that. And so again, I want you to think about that. I want you to know that there's something, and Pastor Andy knows of it, that for 10 plus years there's been something in the valley here called Surge Network. It's a number of 120 different churches have supported lay leader education and eventually led to something called the Missional Training Center. A CRC pastor, professor by the name of Mike Goheen, he taught at Redeemer, he taught at Calvin Seminary, he taught at Dort. He's leading that work, and they have a program where it's Tuesday at 6 a.m., Tuesday at 6 p.m., Thursday at 6 a.m., Thursday at 6 p.m. for 3 hours each time. It's a cohort-based, 4 different cohorts, about 15 to 16 students apiece, and they meet to actually talk about their churches. And these are people not all from the Christian Reformed Church. In fact, we are seeing more of that, especially from churches in Tucson. But there's a reality of the fact that that Missional Training Center that started 10 years ago, and I remember Mike O'Heen being at the seminary and blessing him to start something like that, and they started working with like Covenant and Seminary in St. Louis. But most recently, they made a transition at Covenant and said, we're not so interested in distance education as much. And so Calvin Seminary is now the parent of this church and this church educational program. So that adds 60 more students to our student body. It just got approved, and this is here in Phoenix. So again, I look forward to how that might interface, especially with the Christian Reformed Church and church planters and church renewal, because that's what we are seeking, especially as needs in the Christian Reformed Church. So don't forget the Center for Excellence Preaching. Don't forget about the Missional Training Center. Don't forget about the 28 different nations. Don't forget about the fact that as you pray for Calvin Seminary, and I want to say again, thank you for coming tonight, but thank you for your prayers, your support, encouragement for Calvin, and I'll leave it at that. Although when I say that, I got to remind, there's 2 times that I feel especially a twinge about that. After a service, somebody will come up to me and say, I just want you to know my grandchild is coming to Calvin and did just graduate from high school, and so I know what they're thinking. They're going to go to Calvin University. And I say, it's a fine school, it's a good school. You know, under my breath I go, I went to Trinity Christian College, but no, it's okay. I get a little more nervous when they say, I just sent my check to Calvin. I go, which one? Tonight, we share this program apart because we're the financial institution, Calvin Seminary. It started in many ways with the idea of the fact that there was a person in the Chicagoland area who was involved in prison fellowship. I don't think he'd mind sharing the name because we actually just celebrated him at Calvin Seminary for a legacy award. It was Terry Vanderay. Terry Vanderay in terms of school lines. He was involved with Chuck Colson, involved in prison fellowship. And Chuck Colson said, you need to see what transformation looks like. And he brought him to Angola Prison in Louisiana. Angola Prison, Louisiana, is a state where Angola was, where all the lifers and those who were going to be on death row, that's where they went. It's a plantation. It was very rough. It was, as some people said, the bloodiest prison in the United States. But there was a particular man of faith, Warden Brocane, and there's different stories about what he did and how he did. But eventually a seminary, in terms of New Orleans Baptist Seminary, started to come do classes and start a program. And by the time I visited, they had 40 different congregations behind the walls. And it changed from the bloodiest prison to where the blood of Jesus Christ reigned. One of the professors who went there was a guy named John Rotman. John Rotman was here for your installation. Some of you might know that. So John was here. And John was actually reluctant to go to Louisiana, and reluctant in some ways, but when he came back, many times people ask, is there anything we could do in the state of Michigan? And the stories were told, and Todd will share and Carrie will share some of those stories again maybe, of how that there seems to be an open door, but then sometimes it gets closed again. It's difficult what they do. There are still some of in the system of the prison that don't really want them there. They don't want an educational program. They might not even want a religious program behind the bars. And so they face, I would say, a spiritual battlefield sometimes daily, because they're always wondering, is this going to work or not? It started because there were some prisoners who thought they'd get together and they would wrote a letter to Calvin Seminary and said, we'd like to take classes at Calvin Seminary. I knew one thing. They were not going to come to us. We had to go to them. And so we asked for permission. And the original kind of story is the fact that the warden did not return emails or phone calls. Call him at 10 a.m. in the morning. The warden is at lunch. Call him at noontime. The warden's still at lunch. 2 o'clock, the warden's still at lunch. But the reality is he didn't know what to do. But then he had the director of the whole system come in, Daniel Hines, and some of you know the name Hines Timber Hall, his grandfather. And Alan Lickle's here, and Alan actually knows this story too. Alan served as a retired pastor. He serves with us in development, and he knows the stories of prison through that story of the Hines. But the reality is that Daniel Hines said, it's Calvin, you should do something like that. So we started class at a time. And John Rotman, again, shows up because when he went for the first time to teach in prison, they said, you don't have permission to come in. He was all ready to go, but then he got to the doors, and they turned him away. And we thought, is this going to happen all the time? And there were people inside who were hoping that we'd come in, and they eventually were getting in. But then we're doing just a class at a time. And it came up to whether or not we could do something more. And remember that Daniel Hines I talked about? He went on a trip to Angola that I was privileged to be on with him. And on December 17th, 2013, a day I'll never forget. It's a day that I remember in part because he sent me an email that day. On December 17th, 2013, Daniel Hines emailed me. He says, hi, Joel. He misspelled my name, by the way. Hi, Joel. Kind of appreciate that you got us to see what happens in Angola. I wonder if anything could happen like that in the state of Michigan. And so it went from a class at a time to investigating an accredited program for an associate's degree and bachelor's degree. It went from us by ourselves as a seminary doing it to saying we need an educational partner for the accreditation of an associate and bachelor's degrees. And we started that journey, and I would say that whether it was Michael Leroy or Wiebe Bohr or Greg Elzinga or Bob Knorr, we all would testify that when we go out to share the story, people don't care if it's Calvin Seminary or Calvin University, except remember the checks need to come to Calvin Seminary, okay? In fact, if you open your brochure, right there says so. Here's the envelopes, here's what you pay. They just want to know that the kingdom of God's advanced and people's lives are changed. And I can tell you from a class at a time that's built, and I'm going to let them have the statistics. They can stick around and talk more about that later. But I would just tell you, as a person who's been a witness for these last 10 years, when I got that email on December 17, 2013, the only parallel I can think of related to Scripture is when God said to Paul and Silas, you can't be in this prison anymore, and open those prison doors. And so we felt it, and we followed the prompting of God. And it helps us in the Reformed tradition to say very specifically, one of those quotes that always is quoted about Abraham Kuyper, there's not one square inch over which the Lordship of Jesus Christ is not identified. And he doesn't say it's mine, and that includes the ground behind prison walls. So very early on, we needed help. We needed directors. We need people who are willing to go into that spiritually, sometimes dark place and be messengers of light and love and care, who taught us things like, we don't call them prisoners, right? We're calling them students because they're made in the image of God. So Director Todd Chaffee and Operations Director Carrie Bosma are here, and we're going to let them tell more of the story. But as we make that transition, I just want to give thanks to God with a prayer. To God, thanks for each and every person here. And Lord, I know that for some of them, they're wondering, what is this prison program all about? Help them to see you at work through us. Help them to see you at work by your Spirit, opening doors which we could never open. And dear God, we want to pray even now for their continued service for us, Carrie and Todd and Aaron, Todd's wife, for the choir that's formed, for the classes that take place, and for the blessing that it is to all of us as Christians who need to know that you are at work in our world. So thank you for the pictures of hope and the pictures of your love that will be shown in this next part of this story. In the name of Jesus we pray, amen.
Well, thank you. It's good to be here. I'm glad you came out. So Todd Chaffee, Carrie Bosma, and the Calvin Prison Initiative. So one thing, Jewel kind of gave us some prehistory, if you will, up to the program. The program actually started formally June 1, 2015. June 1, 2015. And at that time, I was helping David Reilersdam, who teaches church history at Calvin Seminary, navigate the college, if you will, in terms of who at the college would be interested in this sort of program. And so when that proposal was finally accepted from David Reilersdam by the Calvin College Faculty Senate at that time, we had a formal program, and they asked me if I wanted to be the director. And I actually said no, didn't want to do it. But I started out as co-director, and then eventually director. And so I've been with the program before it formally started, and then the whole time it's been a formal program. And this is our 9th year. And we've had a footprint at the Handlin Prison since 2011. So we've been in that prison offering courses and making friendships and building community for well over a decade. And so it's remarkable, to say the least. Now, when we talk about prisons, one thing we just have to talk about is the history of incarceration, just for a little bit, in the U.S. and in particular, Michigan. So if I use the phrase mass incarceration, does that ring a bell for you? You've come across that term, maybe read about it, news, something, mass incarceration. And so they didn't talk about mass incarceration in the 50s or 60s or even 70s, but by the late 70s, 80s, 90s, they did talk about mass incarceration. And now we're still dealing with mass incarceration, and we're dealing with the problems that mass incarceration brought. So what I would like to do, which one? Yeah. What I would like to do, is just talk a little bit, and you'll see on the screens, about some of the numbers in Michigan in terms of incarceration rates. And so if you look from 1980 to 2016, the number of incarcerated people went from 300,000 to 2.2 million in the country. 300,000 to over 2 million. By 2007, over 7 million Americans, or put it this way, 1 in 31 adults was either behind bars, on parole, or on probation. So 1 in every 31 adults. We probably have more than 31 adults here, don't we? So somebody here may have fallen under the criminal justice umbrella. Statistically, that would probably be true. Now, I don't know if it is, but you can get the feel just in this crowd alone. Now, this is really fascinating when I first came across these numbers. When you compare it to other countries and you do it per 100,000 citizens, so for every 100,000 citizens, Italy incarcerates 87 for every 100,000 approximately, France 93, United Kingdom 129, the United States 664. And in 2008, you'll see there, in the United States, the number is 1,000. So the U.S. outpaces these countries in terms of incarcerating its citizens dramatically. And if you were to ask, well, what other countries are like the U.S.? Not even Russia. So the U.S. incarcerates more people per 100,000 than Russia. We would actually end up on a lot of lists with other countries like China that we wouldn't want to be on for this. And as you might kind of have a sense or in the back of your head, The majority of offenses that get people incarcerated, about 2/3 in the federal system, half in state prisons, are nonviolent drug offenses. Nonviolent drug offenses. So I like to tell this story to make the point. When we started, I think it was the second year, we admitted a student, Raphael. And Raphael was from the Dominican Republic. And he came to the United States, New York State, to play baseball. He had a scholarship. And in the very first season of play, he had an injury where he couldn't play anymore. And so he was depressed, he didn't know what he wanted to do. He eventually flunked out of school. And a friend that he had made there at school said, well, look, I have some friends in Michigan, and I know how you can make a lot of money real quick. He goes, oh, okay, let's do that. So they went to Michigan, and they started selling drugs. And Raphael gave some cocaine to an associate, and that associate went to go sell the drugs. And they had a sting operation. And the associate got arrested. And then it went back to Raphael, okay? He had never broken a law before in the U.S., never went to prison. They charged him with 3 crimes, each one with a minimum of 20 years, and he had to serve them consecutively, one after the other, not concurrently, all at the same time. So what did he get? 60 years. 60 years. First offense is for 10 ounces of cocaine. They said that because he had given the drugs to an associate to go sell, he was a drug kingpin. The same crime today might get you prison time of 3 to 5 years. So nonviolent, he was a person of color, and at the time, the U.S. had a war on drugs. And so they basically gave him a life sentence. Now, the good news is he got commuted by the governor a couple years ago. The minute he got out, ICE came and picked him up because he was an illegal citizen. And so they deported him back to the Dominican Republic. But he's just one dramatic illustration of that point. Now incarceration in Michigan. So you can see in 1973, it's a little small there, in 1973, there was about 8,000 people incarcerated in Michigan. At its peak in 2006, it goes up to 52,000. And in 2021, we have about 34,000. Now, in terms of the cost, from 1973 to 2006, the cost of incarceration in Michigan rose how much? 5,000%. 5,000%. Today, every year, Michigan spends 20% of its budget, or approximately $2 billion, on incarceration. So here's where I make a point. Joel, you've heard it before. If you're from Michigan, you'll know that the roads in Michigan are wonderful. We really have good roads. And why the Governor Whitmer, ran on the fact that there were such good roads in Michigan. Now, I put it this way. If I said that we're spending $2 billion a year on the roads in Michigan, what would you want to see? Gold paved, just like in heaven, right? Can you imagine what our roads could be if we spent $2 billion a year on them? Now, imagine we're spending $2 billion a year on our roads, and the pothole that is in front of your house remains there year after year after year after year. You would wonder, what are they doing with $2 billion? We spend $2 billion to lock up about 33 or 34,000 people in Michigan. Do you know what we're getting? Are we getting lower crime rates? Are we making safer communities? Is recidivism going down because we lock up people for $2 billion a year? We have no idea what we're getting. And no one's asking. So we're spending a whole lot of money, and that's just Michigan. California, Florida, Texas, all these states, we are spending so much money that they're literally starting to let prisoners out because we can't afford it. That's not a good reason. That's not a very good reason. All right. In Michigan, incarcerated individuals, 54% have children under 18. We know that if you are the child of an incarcerated parent, you are 50% more likely to become incarcerated. So we know that incarceration literally can be generational. So there was a young man in our program, he's now graduated, and his aunt came to a picnic that we have every summer at Calvin Seminary for the friends and family of CPI students. Think of it as like Parents' Weekend. And so we wanted families and friends to get a little feel for the Calvin program, be on the main campus, and then when they call their loved one in prison, they can maybe describe what the campus is like and what it was like to be in that community. So this young man's aunt stands up and she had tears in her eyes. And she said, I want you to know that as far as I know, every male in my family and extended family has either been in prison or is in prison. And as far as I know, nobody went to college. So my nephew is in prison, that I know, but he's now going to college. Anthony said that when he was a young kid, because all the males would either go to prison or were in prison, that the kind of tradition was that the elders in the family would tell the young ones how to do prison time. So guess who told him when he was a boy how to do prison? His grandmother. His grandmother kind of gave him wisdom about how to go to prison. So we know that this is a generational phenomenon. Now, if we know that, we also know this. If we can get one adult in prison to go to school, make certain changes, become rehabilitated, and to get that child on the right path, say go to college, we also know we can break that cycle. So we have many of our students calling home to their children, adult children sometimes 19, 20, and they are comparing notes about college. And they help each other write a paper or study. And so by going to college in prison, this father is giving his children hope and the kind of wherewithal to go on like he is, get that education, and make different choices. Tremendous, just tremendous. Over the past decade, about 20,000, now again in Michigan there's about 33,000 I think right now, 33 or 34, about 20,000 people in prison in Michigan are 17 or younger. We had a student years ago, he eventually got paroled at 51, but he went to prison at 15. And they put him in an adult prison at 15 years old. We had one of our students who was finishing on the main campus. He got paroled. Ron, he went at 16 and served 37 years, starting at 16. So we have guys who went to prison having not gotten their driver's license, never having a job, not knowing how to cook, do their laundry, nothing. And now they go to prison. And they come out sometimes now in their 50s on certain occasions, and they literally have no idea how to be an adult. How could they? No one's taught them, no one's helped them. And so they're a man who's kind of stuck at 15, 16, 17, 18. So we're locking up, frankly, a lot of our youth. 20% of everyone incarcerated in Michigan, 20% has serious mental illness. 1 out of every 5. So at our facility, which houses about 1,300 inmates, I would say just about half or so have mental health issues. So we're a mental health facility. And you will see some of these guys They're heavily medicated, and a lot of them don't leave their cell much. They have poor hygiene. They're understaffed, so they can't really do a whole lot with them. And they really have no main purpose on a daily basis to their lives. I saw one man years ago walking out of the prison with an officer, and he had prison clothes on, but he did not have the chains on that they do if they're going to take you out of the prison, say to go to the hospital or something like that. And I'd never seen that before. Every time I saw someone in prison clothes leave the prison, they had the belly chains and handcuffs and so forth. So as they passed and went, I asked the officer at the gate, I said, is he getting paroled? Because he didn't have the chains on. And she said, well, actually, he was paroled 2 years ago. I said, I understand. She said his mental health is so serious that we could not find an organization or agency to take him, even though he was free 2 years ago. So it was decided that we would just keep him. So he lived as a free citizen for 2 years in terms of an incarcerated life, because nobody knew what to do with him. And so the only reason he was leaving that day is they had finally found a group home that would take him. And I could hardly get my head around that. So we incarcerate a lot of folks with serious mental illness. Oh. Now, we have been blessed over the years with lots of good resources, one of which is we've been allowed to make a number of videos. And so I love it when we have a video to show, because I can talk about the prison program, I can talk about mass incarceration, I can talk about our students a lot, and I do, and I love doing that. But when you can hear it in their own words, it doesn't get any better. So this is one of our students.
I grew up in Southwest Detroit. I grew up wanting to belong. I didn't have that family tie. As I grew older, the only individuals that I could find an acceptance from was the gang. There was a lot of gang activity going on. And eventually I was convicted and sentenced to life without parole. When I came to prison, what I ended up doing, anytime that I felt that there was any issue, any confrontations, I would just lash out. I assaulted a fellow inmate in 2010 at another facility from here. I'm in the hole, and you go into this whole thing of reflecting on your life. And I had that, what we call the aha moment. For me, it was 17 years into my prison bit. I told myself that that was gonna be it for me, that I knew I had to do something different. Unfortunately, at that time, the MDOC did not offer any programs to individuals doing life without possibility of parole. I was transferred to another facility, and that's when I seen the CPI flyer. And for me, what stood out was that it said on the flyer, "Lifers welcome." When I received my acceptance letter, that to me was the point where you feel so good to be able to have a letter that says congratulations. And I've said it before, I've never been congratulated for nothing. I feel that this education has equipped me because I've been taught through CPI how to travel the Bible. I've been taught through CPI about theology. And so now I'm able to do that for my fellow students, to do that for my fellow inmates, and they need that here. CPI and Calvin were the only individuals who saw worth in us. As human beings, as fellow inmates, prisoners, but worthy of something. It's not just an education that's gonna have you get released and go to the world, but more so that if you're gonna stay here, that you can help change the culture in here. And that kind of sets it apart from every other program. And I think that if programs were to focus on that more, I think that we would actually not only change the prison culture, but also make a huge difference in society as well.
Jewel mentioned at the start the connection to Angola Prison in Louisiana. And you heard Wilson just say in the video that as someone serving a life sentence, he was not eligible for programming offered through the Michigan Department of Corrections. So for a long time in Michigan, it just wasn't possible because there were limited resources. The department focused their programming on people who would be getting out. And The Calvin Prison Initiative, because it was modeled after the Louisiana State Penitentiary and the program that New Orleans Baptist Theological Seminary began, they focused on people serving life sentences because of the impact that those individuals could have on the community they were living in. So when the folks from Calvin Seminary went down to Angola, they saw prisoners mentoring other prisoners. When Burl Cain began his time as warden and introduced education, over the next 20 years, the violence levels at Angola prison dropped 85%. That's a significant number. That's why when the group from Calvin Seminary went to that facility and noticed, oh, even though this is a maximum security prison, it feels more like a minimum security prison because there isn't an overwhelming presence of officers. It feels very safe. It doesn't have the same feeling of an ominous, dangerous place. That was the reason that our program decided to emphasize the involvement of folks serving long and life sentences. Almost the entire conversation around higher education in prisons right now is focused on employment readiness for when someone is released from prison. So there are a lot of programs that do vocational training, giving degrees that would prepare someone to, for example, own a business or be involved in an industry. And our program is different from that. So you heard Wilson say that Calvin's program is designed to help people like him have an impact on the prison community. So as we've talked about, we witnessed the impact and the restorative practices of having people who are in the community bring positive impact to their peers, and that's what our program was designed to do. So as Jewel mentioned and Todd has mentioned, our program began in 2015 with an accredited bachelor's degree program. So I want to share a little bit about what that program looks like. The students are in a 5-year BA program. They take classes fall, spring, and summer semester. They get very little time off. They're okay with that for the most part. They take classes for the full 5 years, but along the way they earn 2 academic certificates, an associate degree, and then after the 5th year, a bachelor's degree. The majors that they get are faith and community leadership and human services. These are majors that do not exist on Calvin University's main campus. They were especially designed for this population in the prison context. The faith and community leadership part draws heavily on religion and theology, preparing our students to be ministry leaders in the prison context, and this is very much a reflection of the program at Angola Prison. The human services degree grew out of the students' interest in classes like social work and sociology. They noticed that we were telling them about the kinds of jobs they might do once they graduate in prison, and they said, if we're going to be making an impact and we're going to be working with groups of our peers, we really need some skills for how to do that. So some of those social work classes are really preparing them for some of the jobs that they'll be doing once they graduate. And we'll talk about that a little bit later. To date, we have granted 60 bachelor's degrees, 87 associate degrees, and 155 academic certificates. We admit 25 students per year, and it's a 5-year program, so we will eventually get to 125 student capacity. We had a couple of low number years during the COVID pandemic because there was limited movement of the prisoners between different facilities, but we anticipate next year we'll have 107 students, and then the following year we'll be closer to 120. We have 93 students right now across those 5 cohorts. So this education is really focused on what are they going to be doing when they graduate, but education in and of itself is a transformative experience. And so the students, yes, are looking forward to their careers after they graduate, but they are thoroughly enjoying the education they're receiving along the way, because many of them come from backgrounds and communities where they had really lacking educational systems. So they didn't get a great education if they completed it at all. And I'm going to introduce you to a student named Jamie, and he's going to share his reflection on what getting an education has meant for him.
I came to prison when I was 17 years old. I'd never been to high school. I was fundamentally illiterate when I was in the county jail awaiting trial. And I taught myself how to read and write. I was in maximum security in the county jail, and so I was in a cell by myself, and there was like 4 of us on what is called a pod. And we didn't have a TV, we didn't have a radio, and I was like bored out of my mind. And so my 2 neighbors on either side of me was talking about a story. I didn't know what it was, but they was discussing what had happened in the story as almost like if it was a movie that they had saw. And I asked them, like, you know, what are y'all talking about? And they told me it was a book that they had read. Prior to that, I had never read a book before. I knew how to sound out words. I learned that in elementary school. I knew basic words like the and cat and dog, but I didn't know how to read. I didn't know the benefits of reading. And so just being bored and having nothing to do, I asked them, can I see the book? I didn't tell them I couldn't read though. And so they gave me the book. It maybe took me a month to read that book, just learning how to sound out words and getting every single word right. From that first experience, I was able to get what they was getting, whereas I seen a story inside of my mind unfold as I was reading the story, and I kind of fell in love with it. And so from that point on, I was just reading everything I got my hands on. I would read the rules, I would read stuff on the wall. The more I started to read, I noticed how my vocabulary seemed to increase. I didn't understand why, but that was the result of like doing a lot of reading, doing a lot of writing, and just being able to express myself. In elementary school, the teachers convinced me that I had a learning disability, so I believed that I was slow. I believed that I couldn't do it. And at some point, I just decided, like, well, maybe that wasn't true. You know, maybe I didn't know a lot because nobody sat down to teach me a lot. And so when I embarked upon this opportunity, I decided that I was gonna give myself a chance. You know, I feel like God called me. Like, even though I grew up in this horrible environment, and I feel like this all is an opportunity from God to like do something better with my life. And Calvin Prison Initiative has given me that opportunity, and I'm so grateful.
Excuse me. Want you to think for a minute, reflect with me for a minute. Reflect on the role of education in your life. Reflect on the role of education in your life. How many of you ever had a teacher or a professor say to you, good job? You felt good, didn't you? How many of you ever had a teacher or a professor say to you, you can do this? You can do this. You've got this. How many? Yep. And then were those moments when you would hear that or see that written on a paper back to you where you would say, you know what? Maybe I can learn a lot. Maybe I can do something with this. Reflect on the role of education in your life. Now do this for me. Imagine your life without education. Pull it all out. You didn't hear this here, but Jamie, do you know when he stopped going to school? 6th grade. So imagine a life without education, and then imagine it with. We know the power of education. Many of us in this room are here because of education. In fact, you're here to hear about an educational institution, actually 2 of them. And so my parents didn't go to college. My dad dropped out of high school at 16. But I had teachers and professors along the way say, good job. You've got this. You can do this. I can't go to grad school. No, you really can. And so I'm standing here today because of educators and that opportunity and an educational community and the power and transformative power of education. Now, we know that. But we've denied it or just not wanted to know it for certain groups of people, including prisoners, for a long time. So this becomes important. The RAND Corporation, which is a think tank that looks at social problems, nonpartisan, and tries to give out a series of solutions and says, gee, maybe we should try this, or the research or data shows this, and tries to allow our politicians and policymakers to make good choices. So the RAND Corporation looked at education and its role in prisons with incarcerated students. So it noted that, excuse me, 750,000 inmates are released every year across the country, every year. 66% are re-arrested now again in 3 years, 75% in 5 years. And if you go all the way up to 9 years, it's 81%. So that means if you go to prison once, there is an extremely good chance later in life, whether it's 3, 5, or 9 years, that you will come into contact yet again with the criminal justice system. That means somehow a police officer had to be called. Somehow you had to go to jail. Maybe you had to go back to prison. They showed, through looking at all the educational programs over the last several decades, that education lowers recidivism. So if you can earn an associate degree when you're incarcerated, it lowers it by 14%, or only 14% will recidivate. So less than 1/5, right? If you get a bachelor's degree, just under 6%. If you get a bachelor's and a master's degree in prison, the recidivism rate drops down to 0. Why? Just because they're working? Maybe. Why? Because they have an income? Maybe. But what did education do to you? It's more than a paycheck. It gives you a sense of purpose. It gives you a sense of who you are, what your gifts and strengths are, and you're encouraged to use them and use them well and become who you want to be and make a difference. So it's not just about making a dollar, it's about having a purpose and meaning in life. So the power of education is transformative for all of us, including these men. Jamie graduated with honors. They labeled him as special ed in elementary school. And he graduated with honors. And now, if he could, he would get a master's degree and get probably a PhD, but he also is eager to support his peers in their educational opportunities, encourage them the way he was encouraged. If we're looking at bottom lines, some of the hard facts here, well, here's the reality. For every dollar spent on education in prisons, we save $4 to $5 in incarceration costs. For every dollar spent, we save $4 to $5. Is that a good deal? That's a good one. That is a really good one. If we started doing that in earnest in Michigan, that $2 billion, it would drop dramatically. And then we would use that other money left over to do what? Fix the roads. So this is a win-win-win, right? And it's a no-brainer. We just need books, paper, professors. We've got all that. We're doing it. At the end of the day, I like to think of education really as spiritual and moral formation. We are learning what it means to be human, what the good life consists of, what it means to think and worship God, to be in relationship with God. It is all about who we are becoming and what we ought to be. That's a good education, and that's the kind of education that Calvin provides, whether it's Calvin University or Calvin Seminary. And so one thing our guys will tell us repeatedly, there are some other college programs in the state of Michigan that they've bumped up against over their incarcerated time. But the thing they absolutely love about the Calvin program is that we are trying to form an educational community where together we are being transformed into the people God intended us to be. And they say that really makes all the difference. That I'm not just taught how to write, how to read, how to do math. I'm taught why I should do these things and what I can use them for and how that changes me and you and others. And so it's really about moral formation. You're going to meet James, and he is a living example of this. He is just a living example of how his experience of CPI literally changed his life.
I'm from Jackson, Michigan. I grew up with a mentally handicapped brother, and so a lot of the attention kind of went to him. I kind of felt as if I didn't really find a place within my family, and so eventually I started to dabble in drugs a little bit. About the age of 15, I committed my first felony, and so I went to the youth home, and that began my whole experience in the judicial system. Eventually, I graduated to jail, and then from jail to prison. I did a two-year prison term. I came back to prison a second time. At that point, I kind of started to look at my life and think, wow, this is like becoming, a big problem for me. But I for whatever reason, I couldn't get rid of the drug habit. And then I committed the current offense that I'm serving time on now, which was a home invasion. And I remember laying on the jail room floor in the holding cell, just crying out to God and saying, God, I just cannot live this life anymore. I cannot continue down this path, and I want to do things your way from here on out. I went to court and I received a 20 to 40 year sentence. Once it was all said and done, the dust had settled, I was like, what do I do now? The chaplain came and seen me, and he said, would you like some visitors? So some visitors started to come see me, and he kept encouraging me to get involved in this program called TUMI, which was the Urban Ministers Institute. I loved the program. It was fruitful for me. And towards the end of it, there was news about the Calvin Prison Initiative, and it was just getting up and started. And so I went over there, I filled out the application, and a couple months later, I got the letter that I was accepted. I just remember reading that letter and thinking that this could be like a game changer for me. This could really set the foundation for a new life for me. Calvin comes in and they do something that's unique. They show us that we're human beings, that we have value, that we have worth, and that we have a purpose in life, and that we can step into that purpose. They've revealed to me that as long as I continue to make good decisions and move forward in life and not allow the past to dictate my future, that I can do anything that I want to do. I look at the person that made all those decisions in the past, and I feel as if I don't even know who that individual is. And I feel like I'm still serving time for decisions that somebody else made. It's just mind-boggling to me, the changes and transformations that I've made in the Calvin Prison Initiative.
So what we ask our students to do from day one is to think about, what is God calling you to be and do? What kind of person is God calling you to be, and what is God asking you to do? And we even talk that way to our non-Christian students. And if we have to replace God, we say that's fine, but then we can at least say, what's the moral good of life? What kind of person does that ask you to be? And the moral good, what does that ask you to do with your life? So it's really about vocation. And Christian, non-Christian, it doesn't matter. We say, what we're going to ask you in this program is to take on servant leadership. And so we enter the prison to serve you, and we think we have good biblical grounds for that. Matthew 25, when we visit the prisoner, we're visiting Jesus. We're asking them to do the same. Go into those places, meet those people that you normally wouldn't pursue, and see what you discover both about yourself and that other person. And then what has to be done? And so we talk about vocation. And we've come to a place, based on the needs of the prison and prisons that we've experienced, that there are really 3 vocational tracks, if you will, that we've identified. And we're asking students to discern prayerfully which track they might fit best. So one is academic, one is ministry, and one is peer mentoring. And so the academic is pretty straightforward. We're asking them to become excellent academics, so become fine students themselves, do your best in your classes, develop the skill set that you would need to help another student in that area, maybe as a tutor. We have a rhetoric center where we help students with their communication, whether it's written or verbal. We've even designed programs to help students become teaching assistants to professors. And so sometimes a professor will say, hey, I need a teaching assistant, I need 2. And what will they do? They'll actually help grade work sometimes. they'll lecture sometimes, they run small groups. And so we say, some folks of you, you're going to be more geared towards that academic track, and maybe you should see that as a calling, and that God's calling you to serve that way. Some are called to ministry. Deep need for ministry in the world, but especially in prison, and many men feel called by God to become ministers. We have many men who say, I think I'm called to ordination. And after knowing them for years and years and years, I say, I agree. It sure seems like you should be ordained. And we have men who could literally pastor congregations, put together worship services, teach, preach. And in fact, that's what they did during COVID when we could not enter the prison. Our students ran all the religious services. And so we're the only prison in Michigan throughout COVID, when there's a lockdown, that was able to maintain all its religious services because our men stepped up and provided leadership for that. The third one, peer mentoring, we really learned from Angola. So Angola talks about their graduates as peer mentors, that somebody comes up alongside another person and becomes that mentor and really becomes what that person needs. Is it a counselor type need? Maybe. Is it a guidance? Is it an encourager? What does that person need to be successful? And so we've created kind of this peer mentor spirit. Now, out of that, we also discern practical needs. Like, for instance, the warden that started the program with us, he said, I have a lot of guys who are using drugs and alcohol in prison. And we need a whole lot of help with substance abuse. And so we created a peer mentoring program for substance abuse. And so a lot of our graduates now are running what you basically call AA groups. And where maybe a volunteer or a paid professional can come in and run an AA group once a week, these men are running them daily. And they're living with these men in housing units. And so they can be there really 24/7. We have, as I mentioned before, about half our population in our prison has serious mental health issues. We, together with our facility, the prison, the administration, created a peer mentoring for mental health. And so remember how I said a lot of these guys with mental health hardly leave their cells? Well, we put a lot of our graduates in the housing units with them, and they've gotten them to come out of their cells, play games perhaps, get better hygiene, and now some of them are even working on getting their GED. And so all of a sudden, you have a man who, for mental health reasons, is basically living in a 5x9 cell, now coming out and experiencing the world in a different way, even if it is in prison. So these are three areas that we right now are working with. We hope to keep adding options and more tracks, if you will, but we believe at least that God has given us this for now. And in fact, all our students, by the time they graduate, frankly, would be successful in any one of those tracks. And because of that, we literally had to ask them, you can only choose one. Because if we allowed them, they would do all three. They're so eager to serve because of what they've received. Oops. A minute. It's good. I jumped the gun a little bit. That's okay. So we're talking about when upon graduation. This is just a wonderful clip. This is a glimpse into our graduation ceremony that we should have had in 2020, but we couldn't have because of COVID. And so it's going to be our first graduating class of BAs. And we were so excited, but then COVID hit. So we had to wait a couple years, and by the time we could have it, we had several graduating classes with BAs. So we had this huge graduation, but we made it a huge celebration. And so this is just a glimpse into that. Rose? Do you like shake it or?
Daniel, can you make it go?
You're getting a degree today because you earned it. This is the result of your efforts, your hard work, and your dedication.
We have been given an incredible privilege with this education. And now it is our privilege to serve others with the gifts that we have been given.
I hope that the education you have earned and the degree bestowed upon you today inspires those around you, those in your family, and your friends here on the inside with confidence and belief that they can achieve anything they set their mind to, just as you have.
I missed you so much.
Baby boy. They just seen each other for the first time in 11 years. Yeah, 11 years.
I want to teach. That's like one of the biggest things. I think I need to get a master's degree so I can teach as a professor.
So we are providing an education, but there is a lot more that we're doing. And I think most of you had one of these impact reports at the table, and I hope you take it with you, take an extra to share with a friend. But this is full of stories of the things we're doing in addition to teaching classes in the classroom. And there's stories about graduates, there's stories about the picnic that we're doing. There's stories about our leadership of a consortium now of schools in Michigan working hand in hand with the Department of Corrections to develop the policies and the practices of the higher ed programs in Michigan. And there's a lot going on, and we're happy to do it, but we do need your support. When the program began in 2015, we committed, the seminary graciously committed to raising all of the funds necessary to run the program. There were some schools that were starting to apply for something called the Second Chance Pell Experiment. In the 1994 crime bill, they inserted language saying that incarcerated individuals were not eligible to receive a Pell Grant. And around that time, most of the college programs across the country went away because students no longer had the means to pay for their education. In 2015, the Second Chance Pell Experiment began, and this was the U.S. Department of Education's effort to see what impact it would have on the system if they reinstated Pell Grants. So they had the same research that Todd just showed earlier with the Rand Corporation, that if you invest money in education, it leads to better outcomes. We decided to hold off on applying for that Second Chance Pell Experiment because it was right when the program was beginning and we didn't know what our program was going to look like, and we didn't want to have to worry about requirements or restrictions by the Department of Education. So for the first 5 years, the seminary raised every single dollar to support this program. It was all individuals and foundations who saw what you're seeing and agreed that this was a good investment of their finances. In 2020, we did apply to become part of the Second Chance Pell Experiment. That allowed some of our students to fill out a FAFSA form, just like college-age students. And if they were eligible, we received a Pell Grant for those students. Now, here's something important to know. A Pell Grant in this current academic year is worth $7,395, which is excellent. The cost for us to educate a student in the CPI program is about $10,000. So even when we receive a Pell Grant for a student who's eligible, that's not covering the full cost of their education. And right now, about 64% of our students are eligible for Pell Grants. So we're not getting a Pell Grant for each student. There are programs in Michigan and across the country who will not admit a student into their program if they are not eligible for a Pell Grant, because they don't want to have to find the funds to cover the expenses. There are also programs who are committed to keeping the cost of education as little as possible, which means they're getting professors who maybe have no experience teaching. We've had people show up at our facility teaching for another program for a very short amount of time who had never taught before, and in fact, we found out had a warrant out for their arrest. So these are the kinds of instructors that other schools are trying to line up so that the cost doesn't exceed what they would receive for a Pell Grant. And there are schools that have made a lot of money since 2015 by providing a really cheap education and getting more than what it is costing to provide that education to an incarcerated student. We are committed to providing the same education that I got as a Calvin student, that maybe some of you received as a Calvin student, that my son will receive when he becomes a Calvin student next year. We have the best faculty. We have about 55 faculty who teach for us, and the majority of them are current or retired Calvin University faculty members. They're getting an excellent education. And that means we have a bit of a gap to fill. So in this current fiscal year, our program expenses are just shy of $1 million. Pell Grant revenue in this fiscal year is about $429,000, which is great. Doesn't quite cover the full cost of the education. We did receive a state grant in this fiscal year in the amount of $117,000, and we are making efforts to try to convince the state of Michigan to provide grant funding from the higher education appropriations that they're already giving. There are a few legislative things in Michigan where our students would be eligible to receive state grants, except that the grant language says, if you're incarcerated, you're not eligible. So we're working with legislators and others to try to free up some of those funds. Remains to be seen if that will work, but we got a small grant that contributed to our operating fund this year. That leaves a difference of $443,000 for this fiscal year. So I invite you to consider whether you would like to contribute to join us in this work. In the last page of the impact report that you received, there is a list of things. What does a donation to the Calvin Prison Initiative get you? And it itemizes just some of our expenses. Student supplies is a per student expense that we have because they don't have pencil, paper, a bag to carry those textbooks in. They don't have money to buy books, and so these are all of the things that we're providing to them. We give each student a laptop so that many of them have never held or opened or turned on a computer before, so there's a fair bit of learning there, but in time they're able to write their papers and do academic research on those computers. And so you'll see the ways that your dollars help support our program. So we invite you to prayerfully consider that. Bob has conveniently placed an envelope in the back if you'd like to send a donation. It goes to Calvin Seminary because that's what's on the business reply envelope. But do know that a contribution to this program is not just a contribution for books or for a computer or even for the professor standing in front of the classroom. This education is transforming individuals, and those individuals are transforming communities, both inside and outside the prison. One of the beautiful things that we have seen is that as students are the recipients of this good gift of education and of seeing people like Todd and I and the instructors come in and share the love of God, they want to restore broken relationships. They want to make a positive impact inside the prison and in their families and communities on the outside. One of the things that that our students are realizing is the power of restorative justice, of receiving God's grace and then extending that to other people and repairing what they've broken. They're doing this in a number of ways. We have a restorative justice club where about 2/3, almost 3/4 of our student body are attending this every other week, and they're thinking through how can I fix what I've broken. And I'm going to show a video of one story of one student in our program, and he and some others are working toward some legislation in the state of Michigan to bring about something called victim offender dialogue and restorative justice in Michigan. And not only are they restoring the relationships with their families, but even in some cases with their victim. And so I'd like to share this story with you, and then we'll have time for questions after.
So before prison, it was pretty challenging. It was quite common in our culture for older gentlemen that would be drug dealers or hustlers. They would take the younger guys who were most influenced and get those guys and mold them. Yet it was a trap. And I was destroying my community. I ended up taking a young man's life, a young man that I once considered as a friend. I received a natural life sentence. Yet I remember being in the courtroom and his mother saying to me, "I forgive you because God told me I must forgive you."
I knew that healing had to begin in my community somewhere. And so, being a Christian, I just didn't want to be the one carrying hate, sowing discord. So, in the courtroom, I had to tell this young man that I forgave him. I just didn't want him to feel like he didn't matter anymore.
I didn't understand that at all. In fact, it made me angry. I said, how can she say that to me when I haven't even admitted or confessed that I did this? She never gave up on me though. She kept reaching out, man, and God began to do a thing in my heart.
In February, about 5 or 6 years ago, he called me, and I knew it was from the prison. I knew it was Val Marcus, and he said, "Mother Geraldine, I want to ask you to forgive me."
It took almost 15 years for me to actually call Mother Geraldine and simply say, I'm sorry. I'm sorry. I'm sorry for taking Jeffrey's life. And it's something that I could never, I can't bring him back. But I became determined to make things right. We began to trust one another. Walls began to drop.
My son used to lay in prison and cry, and different people in prison would comfort him. And I wanted to be that comfort for Val. I really did. And so now, I consider him my son.
I lost my mom inside of prison. She's actually become that to me. We talk about everything like it's mind-blowing. Restorative justice is a way for us to make things right.
Do unto others as you would have them do unto you. Put yourself in the place of that prisoner. Put yourself in the place of his mom, his sisters, his brothers, his community. Let's make these young men important to us. They are human beings, and they deserve another chance. Simply because of that.
So we'd like to take a few minutes and answer any questions that you have. Oh, we've got a couple. Let's start over here.
Is there any chance that the prison system would ever reward people, for example, a lifer who finishes a degree knowing knowing the percentages that you gave, wouldn't it make sense to reward these folks with an early parole or whatever?
So we have seen this on an individual basis with some of our students who have gone to see the parole board. So in Michigan, even if you're serving a life sentence, you are seen by the parole board every 5 years. And often the parole board is just saying denied, denied, denied year after year. But we've had several students who, when they go before the parole board looks and says, oh, there's a degree here from Calvin, or there's a support letter here from Calvin. Tell me about that. And then our students, as you've heard, can articulate very well what they've done with their education, what they've learned through it. And some of those students have come back from those parole hearings saying, they asked all about Calvin, and I told them all about Calvin. And then some of them have been released. So there is movement on an individual basis, and we haven't necessarily seen that across the board with all the educational programs, because some of the other college programs in Michigan have only begun in the last year or so, whereas we have students who graduated in 2020 and since then, and so we've been able to have a few more graduates go before the parole board.
So this is an excellent question. In a moral framework, you would think if someone shows that he's rehabilitated, that he's worked hard, you would think you would want to reward that. Here's the problem. When we had the war on drugs, we also had stiffer and stiffer sentencing in our courts. And so even if we wanted to release Val Marcus, who's serving what's called a natural life sentence. So in Michigan, the language is he is not eligible for parole. That was the language at sentencing. So no judge could overturn that today. So what they did back in about 2010, I think it was, the U.S. Supreme Court finally ruled and said you may not sentence a juvenile basically to life without parole. And then they said every state has to go back and review every juvenile who was given a natural life sentence and see if that person should now be resentenced. And then they came up with sentencing guidelines of 40 to 60 years. Now, Val Marcus was not a juvenile when he committed his crime. But those in our program who were 17 or younger, some of them now have been resentenced. And because they have served 25, 30 years, and then there's this good time bill they can actually rack up to 40 years. So we've had several students paroled who were serving natural life sentences but were juveniles when they were sentenced, and they have gotten out. It seems that the courts, the Michigan Supreme Court, the U.S. Supreme Court said 17 or younger, then it gave the right to each state state Supreme Court to decide if they want to raise that number. Michigan just raised it to 18. So we're going to probably see about 6 to 7 of our students get out. We are hearing that a lot of these states, they want us to keep raising that number. So they're going to start saying juvenile 19, 20, because the science suggests that a male brain, in terms of moral development even, doesn't really fully develop until about 25. So that plays a role anyway. The science doesn't command the decision, but it plays a role. So yes, you would think that we would want to start rethinking how we do this, but we created sentencing laws decades ago that kind of hamstring us. And so we've created a perfect storm. Yep. So the question is, are we involved in a women's prison? And the answer is no. There's one women's facility in Ypsilanti, Michigan on the east side near Detroit. And I think already in our second year, we were asked if we would be willing to do something there, but we never figured out how to work with the distance. So thankfully, Eastern Michigan University and Jackson Community College are now pairing up and offering a program in that prison with the women where they get their associates through Jackson Community College, and then they move on to Eastern Michigan University to get their BA. And so finally, the women's prison will have a BA program. So we're thankful for that.
Do you follow your students who have gotten out to see how well they're doing after prison?
Yes. We follow them both ways, meaning this, that if the student graduates in prison and will be a servant leader in prison, we put together teams of our graduates and send them to other prisons, and then they serve in those 3 areas: academic, ministry, peer mentoring. And we do our best to keep up to see how they're doing. And we always get a kick out of this one. So early on in the program, Hope College got inspired by our Calvin program. And we said, well, of course. And they decided that they wanted to put a program together and they wanted our help. And we said, we'll think about it. But we did help them, and they got a program going. And now they're offering a BA program, and I think they're in their 3rd year. And lo and behold, about a year ago, we sent a bunch of Calvin grads over to them to help run their program. And so we have 9 guys, I believe, at the Muskegon prison, where Hope College and Western Seminary are, and they're functioning as tutors and that sort of thing and working with the professors there. So that's exciting. That's very exciting. And then we have other groups at a few other prisons. In terms of if they parole and get out, yes, we have tracked them all. We have almost 20 guys that have paroled. And our recidivism rate is 0. 0. And so it takes a while for a guy, after he's been locked up 30 years, to get on his feet. But we can say that they're all doing pretty well. Some of them are doing outstanding. In fact, one of them got out, finished on the main campus, and we hired him. And so he's been working with CPI now for 4 years. And so he actually oversees all our Pell Grant and FAFSA stuff, and he's the guy who brings in the big dough through the feds. So he's been remarkable for our program.
What do you do for academic preparation to enter the program? For instance, James, I think, mentioned 6th grade capability.
Sure. So the state of Michigan has a requirement that each facility have a principal on staff. This is an MDOC employee, and the students have to get their GED. And so the state of Michigan is providing that bit of academic preparation. Now, it's not stellar. It's not college prep courses. We have an application process, and we evaluate things like writing ability. There's an essay portion. We've learned through experience that we don't want to exclude someone based on, for example, a poor writing sample, because it's exacerbating inequities that happened a long time ago. So someone who didn't get a great education like Jamie may not be a great writer, but we can teach that. So what we're looking for when we're reviewing applications is character and eagerness to learn and eagerness to serve. When they transfer to our facility, so you can be at any of the 27 prisons in Michigan if you're eligible to be at a level 2 facility, which is what ours is. You are then transferred if you're accepted into the program. And we ask that they transfer them in June, and classes begin in September. And during that time, we've asked our graduates to put together a really robust orientation process. And that includes things like a brush up on your English and your grammar and your writing skills. We actually don't have a ton of math in our curriculum. The students do get a liberal arts. We have Math 100, but I'm told, oh, right, okay. So we'll dabble in a little bit of math, but we're really preparing them to become a student. And so there is a lot of anxiety with the students when they start their classes, because it's a lot to jump in. They have Todd as one of their very first instructors, so he gets to read a lot of the bad writing early on. But having a robust rhetoric center, so this is current students and graduates that are trained by the same faculty member who started the Rhetoric Center on Calvin's main campus 30 years ago. He has trained about 15 of our current students and grads to do that writing support and writing help. And so we tell students, we are here to help you develop as students. One of the other classes they take their first semester is called Academic Transitions, and it helps students do things like read dense academic material and learn how to take notes and how to outline and things like that. So we recognize that there is a need and a gap, and we need to kind of get them up to speed. But we try to be as gracious as we can and encourage faculty to be gracious while holding them to a very high standard. So, yeah. How many qualified applicants do we have each year? This past year we had 75 applicants for 25 positions. We, since the program began, have had to rely on the Department of Corrections to identify the potential candidates. And that has been less than ideal because the buy-in from facility to facility is very different. And so we would have some facilities identify 5 or 6 candidates every year, and other facilities never bother to give us a single candidate in the 9 years that we've been doing this. They are working on standardizing some of those processes because there are a number of new programs that are starting, and so they've had to figure out how do we get the people who are interested in education in a pipeline so that they can end up in the right program. And we have about 12 schools that either are running programs or are on the verge of starting them in the next year. But again, the majority of those, with Hope as the exception, are all meant for people with short sentences. So they have requirements that you be within 2 to 5 years of your release date in order to participate in their programs. We have the requirement that you have at least 7 years left until your first eligibility of parole, because we want you to go through the 5 years and still have at least 2 years to serve in the prison context before you're released into the community. So, so there are other programs, but then the Department of Corrections has had to identify ways that they can help get the potential students into the right program. And they're doing the best they can. It'll take a bit though. Yeah, so at our facility, all of the Calvin students are in the same housing unit. This was something that was important early on in reinforcing some of the cultural change or the change in environment that we wanted to see. The previous warden, who was at our facility from 2015, well, before 2015 through 2020, really understood the idea of an honors unit. And by providing an incentive to a group of people, you may incentivize the good behavior and hope that the other folks in the facility would aspire to that. The current administration is the exact opposite and says, why would you want to provide something positive for somebody because that makes everybody else mad? So these are the kinds of challenges that Jewel alluded to earlier, where people have varying degrees of agreement with what we're doing, but they do live together, and that has the potential to provide a positive impact. They're building community as a group. There's, I would say, probably 80 to 85 of the 93 students are in the same housing unit, but the housing units have 250 people in it, so there's also a good number of folks that are not part of our program. The hope is that they're setting an example and setting a high bar for things like behavior, and they are all at the same. So our facility just is level 2. There are several multi-level facilities in the state, but ours is just level 2. So in order to be in our program, you either have to be level 2 eligible, so maybe you're at a level 4 facility, but you could have a level 2 status. They just haven't moved you yet. Or if you're at a level 1, you can actually sign a waiver saying, I'll go to a higher security level facility in order to participate in that program. Any other questions? We are happy to stick around if anybody has questions they haven't voiced, but thank you very much.
Thanks, Todd. Thanks, Carrie. There, we'll stick around. Just a couple of things. I said I hope you walk away with some sense of hope. It's really a dark place, a prison. But because of support, prayers, and encouragement from people like you, we've seen hope. And one of the ways that I've been able to experience this was just to be there. You get thanked a lot when you show up at those special events for the presence. And in some ways, I want to thank you again for what you do. Yeah, we're going to close this up because some of us have to preach tomorrow. But one of the things that we do at different times that we do is invite you to stand, just kind of stretch your legs if you're able. And even though I got a really good choir director over here, Erin, Todd's wife, actually leads the choir that's at the prison. Just stand up, and I'm going to do a short prayer, and then we're going to sing the doxology, all right? To God, thanks for what we've seen and heard. And again, we pray your blessing, your provision, and your protection on the Calvin Prison Initiative, for the students, the faculty, the staff. We even pray again for the prison officials and the Department of Corrections. And tonight, as we heard some of these student stories, as we saw their tears and even saw a reconciliation that we could probably not even imagine. And yet the reality is our sins brought your son to death. But because of the forgiveness that was displayed through the cross, we are gathered here tonight. Thank you for these brothers and sisters in faith. May we be encouraged again by your work, your gospel, and the people you call to such work. In the name of Jesus, we pray. Amen. Praise God. Thanks again to Phoenix Church for hosting us. Have a good night. Safe drive home.